The land was quiet that morning, eerily quiet. I stood on my porch, coffee in hand, watching a thin line of dust curl into the sky beyond the tree line. For over a century, this land had belonged to my family. 40 acres of open fields, wildflower patches, and an old cedar cabin that had outlived 3 generations of stubborn Texans. To outsiders, it might have looked like an untouched stretch of dirt. To me, it was legacy. That's why the bulldozers in the distance doesn't make sense by the time I reached the far ridge. The scene unfolded like a bad dream. Surveyors hammered stakes into the ground. Men in hard hats unfurled blueprints, and towering above them all stood a woman in a blazing pink pantsuit, pointing like a general on a battlefield. That was the first time I laid eyes on Karen Delaney, the self-proclaimed president of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association. Blonde bob, oversized sunglasses, and a clipboard clutched like a sword, she saw me and smiled. It wasn't the kind of smile neighbors exchanged. It was the smile of someone who thought they were doing me a favor. "You must be the owner of that quaint little cabin," she said, like she was commenting on a historical curiosity. "Don't worry, we're revitalizing this entire zone. You're going to love what we're doing here." I blinked. "Revitalizing? This is private land. You're on my property." Karen's laugh was high-pitched and dismissive. "Oh, sweetheart, the city's already approved everything. Rezoning, development rights, you name it. You should be thanking us. Property values are about to shoot through the roof." She said it like the deal was done, like my family's name on the deed didn't matter, but it did. I drove straight to the county records office, expecting a quick fix. Some clerk had to have made a mistake, but the deeper they dug, the worse it got. My grandfather's deed was still on file, buried beneath layers of recent addendums and revisions that reclassified the land as abandoned and transferred it to the city's Urban Development Board. "Must have been a paperwork error," the clerk muttered, flipping through files without meeting my eyes. But I knew better. Karen hadn't just waltzed onto my land by accident. Somewhere between her designer heels and those fraudulent documents, she'd orchestrated a takeover. She'd found a way to make my land disappear on paper, assuming I'd either roll over or didn't have the resources to fight back. She was wrong. 2 weeks later, construction ramped up. Heavy machinery flattened the northern fields where my grandfather once planted wheat. Concrete foundations replaced wildflower meadows. Within a month, steel frames shot up and shiny Willow Creek Phase 1-inch banners fluttered where old oak trees used to stand. Every morning, Karen's pink SUV would cruise past my cabin. Every evening, she'd host HOA preview meetings, right at the property line, all within earshot, flaunting her victory. She'd wave with that same condescending grin, as if she was offering me a front row seat to my own defeat. But I wasn't going anywhere. Karen had built her empire on 2 things: fraudulent paperwork and the assumption that no one would push back. But I had a secret weapon she hadn't accounted for: the original deed, signed, sealed, and tucked safely in my grandfather's old lockbox, untouched by city hands. I could have gone to court immediately, but I knew how people like Karen operated. She thrived on appearances. She needed the illusion of power more than power itself. I needed her to feel untouchable, so when she fell, she'd fall hard. But even I didn't expect how fast her arrogance would grow. Within 3 months, she had 98 homes under construction, each one designed with premium modern aesthetics and exclusive community amenities. She was already selling lots, promising prospective homeowners a slice of suburban paradise complete with a rigid list of HOA restrictions. Of course, Karen thought she was building a legacy. What she was really building was an empire on stolen land, and I was going to make sure it all came crashing down. Karen Delaney didn't just build homes, she built a kingdom. By summer, Willow Creek wasn't a construction site anymore. It was a sprawling suburban labyrinth of beige vinyl siding and perfectly manicured lawns, a place where conformity was packaged as community. Karen ruled it all from her self-appointed throne at the HOA Welcome Center, a glass-walled office that sat like a crown jewel at the neighborhood's entrance. She even had a plaque outside: Karen Delaney, founding president of Willow Creek HOA. Her reign was absolute. If a homeowner's grass was an inch too tall, they'd wake up to a fine. If a child's bicycle was left on a driveway, the family would receive a sternly worded violation notice. She dictated everything: mailbox colors, curtain patterns, even the acceptable breeds of household pets. Her rules weren't guidelines, they were gospel. And yet, despite all her power, she couldn't erase the property line. My cabin stood defiantly at the edge of her perfect neighborhood, an old cedar scar in her picture-perfect vision. She hated it, hated me. But Karen was careful, publicly polite, privately venomous. The homeowners, however, were beginning to see through the facade. At first, they admired her energy. Karen hosted lavish HOA mixes, complete with catered brunches and live acoustic bands on Sundays. She smiled for every photo op, parading herself as the benevolent matriarch of Willow Creek. But beneath the mimosas and manicured smiles, resentment simmered. I started receiving quiet knocks on my door, homeowners fed up with Karen's tyranny. They whispered stories of absurd fines and relentless harassment. A young couple showed me a notice they'd received for hanging wind chimes. Karen deemed them audible clutter. An elderly widow was fined for planting daisies instead of the HOA approved. Petunia's Karen's empire was rotting from within, but the homeowners were trapped. Every complaint was silenced with legal jargon and HOA bylaws they never even knew existed. Karen had written the rules herself, and she wielded them like a sword. That's when I knew this wasn't just my fight anymore. I gathered the residents, who dared to speak out, and showed them what Karen had hidden. The deed to the land beneath. Their feet still bore my family's name. They were stunned. For the first time, the cracks in Karen's narrative were undeniable. The homes they bought, the dream they paid for, were built on a foundation of fraud. "You're telling me she doesn't even own the land?" a man asked, his voice trembling. Between disbelief and anger, "I'm telling you," I said. "She built an empire on paper lies." But Karen wasn't one to surrender control easily. When word of my little gathering reached her ears, she retaliated. Overnight, my mailbox was vandalized. HOA violation notices were taped to my cabin's door, ridiculous infractions, claiming my porch swing was a visual nuisance and my gravel driveway diminished community aesthetics. It was Ken's way of declaring war. But I was done playing defense. The next morning, I filed a cease and desist order against the HOA, citing unauthorized usage of private property for HOA operations. Legally, it froze her ability to enforce rules or collect dues until ownership could be clarified. Karen's reaction was predictably dramatic. She stormed up to my cabin, flanked by 2 HOA board members who looked more like frightened interns than enforcers. Her pink suit was sharper, her sunglasses darker, but the smugness had a crack in it now. "This little stunt won't work," she hissed. "You're standing in the way of progress." "No, Karen," I said evenly. "I'm standing on my land." Her lips twitched, searching for a comeback, but she turned sharply, heels stabbing into the gravel as she marched away. Later that week, she filed a lawsuit against me, accusing me of obstructing community development and intimidating residents. It was a desperate move, a play to buy time and keep up appearances. But Karen didn't realize the fight had shifted beyond courtrooms. I had begun assembling a case file, a damning stack of fraudulent deeds, backdoor rezoning approvals, and emails tying her directly to a corrupt city official. I wasn't just going to reclaim my land, I was going to expose every underhanded move she'd made to get there. Karen had built a fortress of power, but she'd forgotten one thing: she'd built it on stolen ground. Soon, the entire foundation would give way. Karen Delaney thrived on control, but the moment I filed the cease and desist, her grip began to slip. With HOA operations legally frozen, her once ironclad rules turned into hollow threats. Homeowners who had been fined for trivial gnomes, porch chairs, even mailbox fonts now saw an opportunity. They began to push back. The first act of defiance was small, a single red lawn chair placed boldly in a front yard, but like a spark in dry brush, it ignited something bigger. Within a week, wind chimes jingled on porches, kids' bicycles lined driveways. Residents openly questioned HOA fines. The fear that had kept Karen's empire standing was cracking. She tried to reassert authority, striding down streets, clipboard in hand, but it wasn't the same. People had seen the deed. They knew the truth. Karen's retaliation was swift. She hosted an emergency HOA meeting in the newly constructed community clubhouse, summoning homeowners to what she called a clarification session. I attended not as a resident, but as the landowner whose cabin still stood unbowed at the neighborhood's edge. She stood at the podium, flanked by her board members who looked increasingly uncomfortable in their seats. "Ladies and gentlemen," Karen began, flashing a politician's smile, "there has been misinformation spreading regarding the ownership of Willow Creek. Rest assured, the HOA operates within full legal jurisdiction." A murmur rippled through the room. I raised my hand. Karen's eyes narrowed. "Miss Delaney," I said, standing slowly, "would you like me to read from the original property deed? Or should we go straight to the part where you forged documents to claim land that was never yours?" The room went silent. Karen's composure faltered for a split second. Then, like a true manipulator, she pivoted. "This is exactly the kind of disruption that threatens our community. He doesn't understand how these processes work." But her words fell flat. The crowd wasn't buying it anymore. That night, homeowners gathered outside my cabin. People who had once nodded politely now spoke with frustration, anger, and most importantly, determination. They weren't just upset about Karen's lies. They were furious that she had gambled with their homes, their mortgages, their futures. I laid out my plan. "I'm filing a lawsuit to revoke the HOA's authority over this land. I've got the original deed emails tying Karen to fraudulent rezoning and enough evidence to take this to court. But I'm not doing this to throw anyone out of their home. This is about cutting off her power for good." One by one, they pledged support. But Karen wasn't going to surrender quietly. In a last-ditch effort, she hired a high-powered law firm to file a countersuit against me, alleging slander, harassment, and obstruction of community welfare. It was a scare tactic, a legal smokescreen to drain my resources and slow me down. Unfortunately for Karen, I had allies she didn't expect. One of the homeowners, a quiet man named Russell, was an investigative journalist. He'd been documenting Karen's missteps from the day she announced Willow Creek. Another resident, Maria, worked in city planning. She had access to files Karen prayed would stay buried. Together, we crafted a dossier so airtight that even Karen's slick attorneys couldn't poke holes through it. But the real turning point wasn't in a courtroom. It came when Russell published a bombshell exposé detailing Karen's fraudulent land acquisitions, her backdoor deals with city officials, and a litany of abuses inflicted on homeowners. The article went viral overnight. News vans lined the streets by morning. Reporters swarmed the HOA office, demanding interviews. Karen tried to hide behind statements of ongoing legal proceedings, but the public scrutiny was relentless. The image she had so carefully crafted a visionary community leader crumbled under the weight of her own lies. Residents began tearing down HOA signage. The clubhouse Karen had paraded as her headquarters was repurposed into a community forum where homeowners, no longer subjects but stakeholders, met to discuss life after the HOA. Karen still had one move left: denial. She hosted a live Zoom attempting to salvage her reputation. But as she spoke, the comment section filled with homeowners she had wronged, neighbors she had silenced, and viewers who now saw her for what she was: a fraud draped in suburban pastel. The walls of her empire were collapsing, not from a wrecking ball but from within. But I knew Karen. She wouldn't leave without a fight, and the final battle was coming in court, under oath, in front of cameras she couldn't control. The courtroom was packed. Karen Delaney sat at the defendant's table, flanked by a legal team that looked less like attorneys and more like damage control specialists. Gone was the flamboyant pink suit. Today she wore muted gray, blending in, trying to look small, harmless, an ironic contrast to the empire she had tried to build on lies, but the evidence wouldn't shrink with her. On my side sat the homeowners, dozens of them. People who had once feared HOA fines now sat ready to testify, ready to reclaim their community from the woman who had tried to own them. The judge, a no-nonsense woman with a sharp gaze, wasted no time. "Mr. Walker," she said, addressing me, "you're asserting that the land beneath Willow Creek remains your private property." "Yes, Your Honor. This is the original deed, signed and recorded decades ago." "Karen Delaney's filings are fraudulent." Karen's lead attorney objected, claiming there was no material harm since the homes had been built and sold. But the judge wasn't swayed. She ordered the county records be presented. Maria, the city planner turned whistleblower, stood and handed over the corrected documents, proof of forged signatures, doctored rezoning maps, and email chains directly implicating Karen and a now suspended city official. Karen's face was expressionless, but her foot tapped relentlessly beneath the table. When Russell, the journalist, was called to testify, he recounted the timeline of Karen's land grab with precision, how she leveraged bureaucracy, silenced homeowners, and manufactured legitimacy through sheer audacity. It wasn't a courtroom drama. It was a dismantling. Karen's attorneys scrambled for procedural loopholes, but every angle had been accounted for. The homeowners' testimonies painted a damning portrait: fines for non-existent violations, threats of foreclosure, even incidents of surveillance. Finally, the judge leaned back, hands folded. "The court finds the Willow Creek Homeowners Association's claim to this land invalid. Ownership remains with Mr. Walker, as per the original deed. All HOA activities are to cease immediately. Furthermore, Ms. Delaney, you will be held personally liable for damages arising from fraudulent development and abuse of power." A hush swept through the courtroom, then a murmur of disbelief. Karen's empire had just been erased with a single ruling. She stood slowly, like the air had been knocked from her lungs. No smirks, no comebacks, just a hollow stare as reporters closed in, their cameras now weapons exposing her downfall. But the story wasn't over. The ruling gave me back the land, but the people, the families who had unknowingly bought into deception, deserved security. That evening, I held a meeting in what used to be the HOA clubhouse. No suits, no titles, just neighbors gathered to figure out what came next. Some expected I'd evict them, reclaim the land, and wipe the slate clean, but that was never my plan. "I'm not here to take your homes," I said, "but this community will no longer be ruled by anyone who thinks they can own people with fines and threats." I offered them a new path, a resident-led cooperative, free from HOA tyranny. Every family would sign a direct lease agreement with me, ensuring their homes were secure and their voices would actually matter. The shift was immediate. The energy in the room transformed from apprehension to relief. Where Karen had used rules to control, we would now use agreements to protect. In the days that followed, HOA signs came down. Mailboxes that had been non-compliant were repainted in colors families actually liked. The oppressive air of forced perfectionism lifted, replaced by an authentic community spirit Karen could never manufacture. As for Karen, she vanished from Willow Creek in the dead of night. Her assets were frozen, lawsuits piled up. The last image of her that circulated was a grainy photo of her loading cardboard boxes into a battered moving van. The Delaney Estates for sale sign drooping in the background. She had built 98 homes on stolen land, convinced she could rewrite ownership with signatures and scare tactics. But in the end, she couldn't erase the truth. Standing on my porch, I watched as kids rode their bikes freely, Wind chimes sang from front porches, and neighbors waved in not out of obligation, but because they finally felt at home. The land had never left my family, but now it truly belonged to the people who lived on it, every inch of it.